The Pittsburgh Steelers are a team that is full of storylines heading into 2026 training camp, and that's almost an understatement given everything swirling around the organization this offseason. That's always going to be the case with a team that is being quarterbacked by Aaron Rodgers and that also has a new head coach steering the ship, so in many ways it's simply par for the course for a franchise that hasn't shied away from big personalities and bold moves in recent years. Between the quarterback situation, the coaching transition, and the usual questions about whether Pittsburgh's roster is finally positioned to get over the hump in a loaded AFC, there's no shortage of angles for reporters and fans to dig into as Latrobe approaches. Outside of Rodgers reconnecting with his former head coach, a reunion that will draw plenty of attention on its own given the history between the two and the expectations that come with pairing a future Hall of Fame quarterback with a coach who already knows how to get the best out of him, fans will also be paying close attention to a lot of the younger guys on the roster. This will include the inexperienced players from previous draft classes who have not quite found their footing on the team or in the NFL yet, as well as the rookies who were drafted this past April and are looking to carve out immediate roles in a competitive locker room. Younger players developing is important to the franchise given the age of the current roster, particularly on offense, where the Steelers have leaned on a mix of proven veterans and improving youth in recent seasons without always getting the answers they were hoping for. Pittsburgh's roster construction under Omar Khan has generally prioritized aging out a championship window rather than a full rebuild, which means the margin for error with young, cost-controlled talent actually developing into contributors is thinner than it might be for a team with a longer runway. That's part of why fans are so eager to see what Jeremy Bernard and Roman Wilson can do this summer. They will be battling for the third wide receiver spot on the depth chart behind the presumed top duo, and how that competition shakes out could say a lot about the direction of Pittsburgh's receiver room for years to come. This will be an especially important position battle for Wilson after he did not have the best relationship with Rodgers during the 2025 season, a dynamic that became increasingly hard to ignore as the year progressed and that ultimately led to him being a healthy scratch near the end of the season. For a former third-round pick who many in Pittsburgh hoped would develop into a legitimate difference-maker at the position, watching him fall out of the game-day rotation entirely, not because of injury but because of a perceived lack of trust from the starting quarterback, was a discouraging development for a player who was supposed to be trending in the opposite direction heading into his third professional season. Beat writer Chris Carter joined 93.7 The Fan on Friday morning, and he was asked directly about Wilson and what to expect from him heading into this upcoming training camp. Carter didn't dance around the subject, offering a fairly candid assessment of where things stand for Wilson both in terms of his immediate roster standing and his longer-term future with the organization. He spoke at length about whether or not Wilson's spot on the roster is in jeopardy as the team prepares to head to Latrobe for the start of camp, and his answer reflected a nuanced view that separates Wilson's short-term job security from his long-term standing within the building. "I'd say for this roster, yes," Carter said. "Because I think he still has the speed to be a threat on the offense as a fourth or fifth wide receiver. I don't know that Roman Wilson would get passed up necessarily by Ben Skowronek or Eli Heidenreich or Caden Wedgen. I do think as far as his long-term job, it's very much on the line. If he can prove this year that he's competition for Jeremy Bernard and the two of them can kind of duke it out for the third wide receiver spot, that'll be a good sign that Roman Wilson is showing progress. The Steelers can be like, okay, we kind of want him as a part of this rotation of wide receivers." That distinction Carter draws is an important one, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. On one hand, Wilson's raw traits, particularly his speed and ability to separate from coverage, are not in question. Those are the kinds of tools that keep a player employed in the NFL even during rough stretches, because speed at the receiver position is difficult to find and even more difficult to teach. Carter's point about Skowronek, Heidenreich, and Wedgen is essentially an acknowledgement that none of those players offer the same kind of vertical juice that Wilson brings to the table, which means Wilson's floor as a roster piece, even in a worst-case scenario where he loses the battle with Bernard for the third receiver job, is probably safe for at least this coming season. On the other hand, Carter's larger point cuts right to the heart of why this training camp and preseason carry so much weight for Wilson specifically. Simply hanging onto a roster spot as a fourth or fifth receiver isn't the outcome anyone in the Steelers organization was hoping for when they used a valuable draft pick on him. The hope, obviously, was that he would develop into more than organizational depth, and Carter's framing suggests that this summer represents something close to a final proving ground for Wilson to demonstrate that he belongs in a more meaningful role within Pittsburgh's offense going forward. Carter believes that Wilson is going to be on the roster for the Steelers in 2026 no matter what happens over the course of camp and the preseason, which speaks to the value the team still places on his physical tools and the sunk cost of a draft investment that hasn't yet paid off. But there is a very real chance that his long-term job could be in jeopardy if he does not perform well over the coming weeks and months. He would likely be kept around for depth purposes even if he has a disappointing camp and preseason, simply because a team can never have too many bodies at receiver heading into a long regular season full of inevitable injuries. But his chances of remaining with the Steelers beyond the 2027 season, according to Carter's assessment, would be near zero if this summer doesn't produce meaningful signs of growth. Wilson and Bernard will be squaring off for that third receiver spot throughout training camp, and the coaching staff needs to see at least some promising signs from Wilson if they're going to feel comfortable building him into the offense in any expanded capacity. He needs to be able to keep things close with Bernard, or ideally win the battle outright, in order to cement himself as part of the rotation on the outside rather than someone who's fighting just to make the 53-man roster as a special teams contributor and emergency depth option. Given the uncertainty that has followed Wilson since his rookie season, there's an added layer of pressure to this camp battle that goes beyond a simple two-man competition. It's really about whether Wilson can show the new coaching staff, and perhaps more importantly Rodgers himself, that last year's disappearing act was a product of circumstance and lack of opportunity rather than a fundamental mismatch between his skill set and what the Steelers need from that spot. Carter continued on the possibilities for Wilson's future, laying out a scenario that would represent something close to organizational limbo for the young receiver if Bernard clearly wins the job. If it's clear that Bernard's receiver number 3, Wilson doesn't have much to say about it, they'll keep him on the roster because they need depth, Carter said. But I think next year would be his last year as a Pittsburgh Steeler at that point. That comment underscores just how much is riding on this specific window of time for Wilson. If Bernard clearly establishes himself as the superior option and takes hold of the third receiver job in a way that leaves little room for debate, Wilson would essentially be relegated to a depth role for the 2026 season with the writing already on the wall for his departure the following year. It's not necessarily a doomsday scenario in the immediate term. Teams keep improving but talented depth pieces around all the time. But it would represent a significant step back from where the organization hoped Wilson would be by this point in his career, and it would put him in the difficult position of playing out what amounts to a lame duck season in Pittsburgh before hitting the open market or being non-tendered as his rookie contract expires. The 2027 season marks the end of Wilson's rookie deal with the Steelers, and per Carter's evaluation, it would likely be his final season with the franchise if he does not find a way to break through before then. That timeline gives Wilson essentially one full off-season and training camp, this current one, to change the trajectory of his career in Pittsburgh before the calendar starts working against him in a more urgent way. NFL careers can pivot quickly based on a strong training camp or a hot start to a season, but they can also stagnate just as fast when a player fails to separate himself from the pack during the exact stretch when opportunities are supposed to present themselves. That reality might be something Wilson would actually welcome, at least on some level, given the way things have gone for him in Pittsburgh so far. There's a version of this story where a fresh start with a different quarterback, a different scheme, and a coaching staff that hasn't already formed strong opinions about him might genuinely benefit a player whose tools have never really been the issue. Sometimes it takes a change of scenery for talented but underutilized players to find the right fit. And if Wilson's time in Pittsburgh continues to be defined by trust issues with the starting quarterback rather than his actual on-field ability, there's a reasonable argument that both sides might be better off going their separate ways sooner rather than later. If things do not go Wilson's way leading up to and during the 2026 season, he should probably want out of Pittsburgh, if only because staying in a situation where he's fighting an uphill battle for playing time and respect doesn't serve his long-term career interests. He was, by a lot of accounts, the only wide receiver in Pittsburgh during the 2025 season who could consistently get separation from opposing defensive backs, a trait that should be enormously valuable to any offense trying to generate explosive plays through the air. Yet he was reportedly a few inches or a yard off with where he was supposed to be on certain route concepts, small technical details that, fair or not, were apparently enough for Rodgers to lose confidence in him and have him effectively banished to the sideline for stretches of the season. That dynamic raises a broader question that extends beyond just Wilson's individual situation. Maybe the quarterback should have to adjust a little bit as well, regardless of what he has accomplished over the course of a decorated career. Rodgers has earned the benefit of the doubt in a lot of situations given his track record, but there's also a version of quarterback-receiver chemistry that requires give and take on both sides, particularly when working with a younger player who is still refining the finer points of route running at the NFL level. Elite quarterbacks throughout history have had to find ways to work with and develop younger targets even when the timing wasn't immediately perfect, and there's a case to be made that a veteran of Rodgers' caliber and experience should be equipped to help coach up a player like Wilson rather than simply removing him from the game plan when things aren't syncing up right away. This new coaching staff will hopefully approach that situation in a wiser manner than what unfolded during the 2025 season, recognizing both the value of getting Wilson more repetitions to iron out those small technical issues and the importance of fostering a level of communication and trust between him and Rodgers that clearly wasn't there before. Adam Henry, the new wide receivers coach brought in as part of this offseason staff overhaul, will play a critical role in that process, given his reputation for being a detail-oriented technician who focuses heavily on route precision and the kind of nuanced footwork and spacing issues that Wilson reportedly struggled with last season. If Henry can iron out those small discrepancies in Wilson's game while simultaneously building a stronger rapport between the young receiver and his quarterback, there's a real chance that Wilson's 2026 training camp could look drastically different from the disappointing arc his 2025 season ultimately took. Ultimately, this summer sets up as one of the more fascinating internal position battles on Pittsburgh's roster, not just because of what it means for who lines up as the third receiver on opening day, but because of what it represents for the futures of both Wilson and Bernard within the organization. Bernard, for his part, will be looking to build on whatever flashes he showed as a younger, less experienced player trying to climb the depth chart, while Wilson will be fighting to prove that last year's frustrations were a temporary setback rather than a permanent ceiling on his role in this offense. However that battle plays out over the coming weeks in Latrobe and into the preseason, it's clear that the stakes for Wilson specifically extend well beyond just this single training camp, with real implications for how long his time in Pittsburgh ultimately lasts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.